Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a number of basically the reverberations of the Dobbs decision, the Supreme Court decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. Uh, at TPM, we have been dedicating a lot of time to how Congress might potentially overrule what the Supreme Court did in Dobbs. Basically, come back and legislate a national abortion right and how that plays into the midterm election and so on and so forth. But as has been clear, well, it was clear long before Dobbs, but it has been clear ever since Dobbs came down. Abortion, the jurisprudence over abortion is tied to something called the right to privacy. And the way that this decision was overturned made pretty clear that this current Supreme Court does not think there is a right to privacy. Now, some of the justices were very quick to say, hey, this has nothing to do with anything else. This is just abortion. Don't get mad at us, blah, 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 blah. Whereas others, like, Justice Thomas in his concurrence were like, fuck it. We're doing it, get ready. So there has been a push in recent days among Democrats on Capitol Hill to say, whatever we're going to do about abortion, potentially, national abortion right in early 2023, let's talk now about a national right to contraception, because the right to contraception is one of the decisions with the right to privacy. It's not the first exactly. It's a little more complicated than that. But basically, it's the decision where that kind of stream of jurisprudence really kind of comes into play. So I think to many of us, it feels almost absurd that we're even talking about this. Contraception is no longer something that people have to go and kind of, whisper to the pharmacist, right? There's a whole rack in the CVS, all sorts of stuff. You can buy it. It's just, it's everywhere. And yet, as we know, there is a strong traditionalist element in the American political framework that just doesn't like what contraception makes possible, which is basically sex more or less without risk for enjoyment. Or, obviously various kinds of family planning, blah, 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 blah. And it also intersects with the abortion issue since many diehard anti-abortion advocates believe that a number of things that many of us consider contraception, are actually abortions. And it has to do with sort of the technical details of implantation and all this kind of stuff. So contraception, marriage equality, and even the right to marry someone even if they're of a different race than you are. Most of us consider this kind of stuff went out with, like, slavery and Jim Crow, and yet the court decision on that, God, I don't know the exact year. It's only in the early 60s, I believe, the Loving decision. So Democrats have been saying, let's try to pass laws about these things now. Let's reinforce this. These things have not happened yet, but there's clearly a faction on the court that wants to overturn those rulings too. So let's confirm these rights through legislation. And we can all recognize that these things operate on two different levels. If you can succeed legislatively, great. Then you've sort of put a whole class of Americans, remove some anxiety from them, remove some risk from them, because now you have a law, and that at least, like I said, reinforces the right. If Republicans block it, then you have another issue you take to the midterm election. Now, people often act as though, if you say then it's an election issue. That's kind of cynical and cheap. You're just make it an election issue. But this is what elections are for. You want to say what is actually on the line. You say, I'm going to vote for Democrats, I'm going to vote for Republicans, I'm going to vote for, I hate Biden, I love Biden. Making something an election issue is to say, this is what we're talking about. This current Congress is unwilling to legislate to make clear that you can if you're white, you can marry a black person, you can marry an Asian person, blah 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 blah. Okay. So that is going on, and as I said, it's either a legislative success, or it becomes a question to litigate in the midterm election. And for Democrats, both are positives. So why not? Let's do it right now. Now, something happened yesterday that and as I said, there's been a growing push for this, in addition to the politicking over abortion and Dobbs, particularly in the House, to push these things through. Let's do it. We have the majority now. Let's do it. So yesterday, they voted on something called the Respect for Marriage Act, and probably as you'd expect, all Democrats voted for it. But what the surprise was that 47 Republicans voted for it too. And there's, give or take a little over 200 Republicans. So that's between 20 and 25%. It's a significant chunk of the caucus. And if you look at who actually voted, it's an interesting cross section. A lot of it's clearly generational. Younger people, just this is a settled issue for them, kind of regardless of their politics. One thing that kind of jumped out at me, although I don't have statistics, is that there are a number of Hispanic members of the GOP House caucus. Not a huge amount, but a number, and a lot of them were yeses on this. Not surprisingly, so were a lot of people who've already been kicked out of the party. Both Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, I believe, voted for it. And so did most of the reps who either directly or indirectly have already been forced to retire because of Trump, because they voted for the commission or, whatever like that. In any case, it was a big surprise to pretty much everybody that many Republicans voted for it. What came in the subsequent reporting, the minority whip, they didn't make it a party vote. And what that means is they're basically saying to their members, hey, vote just what you think. This is not a party loyalty thing. We don't have a party position. Do what you feel. Now, when that happened, suddenly it started to look a little different in the Senate, because most people have been assuming they're going to shut this down in the Senate. So this is going to be another argument for why you need to add to the Democratic caucus. Same line of thinking about a Roe law, an abortion law in 2023. But when that happened, if 47 House members are voting for it, suddenly it puts the, to the extent they exist, moderates in the Senate in a kind of a different position. You can't just kind of easily say no. One thing, when the Democrats voted for their Roe bill in late spring, Murkowski and Collins, who were supposedly pro-choice, they voted to sustain the filibuster. Right? So it's kind of you're allowed to do that. Like you support abortion rights, but you're going to block it just because of party loyalty. So that suddenly changed. And I was talking to someone very high up over in the Senate on the Democratic side yesterday, and it was clear to me that they didn't see that coming. So they kind of didn't really see it as something that was going to be a big issue in the Senate, just like like everything else that Republicans block. And so, and Kate and I were just talking before we started about, it could go through. We don't know. I mean, you probably wouldn't do bad if you had to place a bet against it. But it's not just one of these things. Like every single thing in the Senate, we know Republicans are going to block unless well, I was going to say 460 votes, but the point is, maybe there will actually be 60 votes. So that's something we're talking about now. Now, one thing that I want to make clear, and I was a little unclear about this last night because when I first reported this, it was based on my own reading of the actual bill. And I am not an expert. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert on legislative language. But people were presenting it as this legislates a national right to same-sex marriage. And the bill also covers interracial marriage. But on same-sex marriage, that is not exactly what it does. It does something close to that, but not precisely. What it does is this. It overturns the Defense of Marriage Act, which was the Clinton era act that Republicans kind of jammed him into, but kind of everybody supported. I mean, not everybody, but overwhelming bipartisan support back in the 90s. Gets rid of that, which basically takes the federal government out of the same-sex discrimination business. And even though you have the court decision, it was never repealed, right? It's still kind of sitting there. So in theory, it would pop back into place if Obergefell was overturned. So it says that the federal government will recognize same-sex marriages. Now, that obviously is hugely important for Social Security, for benefits, for everything under the sun, with all the ways that we as humans interact with the federal government. Really big deal. It also says that if you were married to a same-sex partner in, say, Mississippi, after the Supreme Court decision, that if it is overturned, your marriage will not disappear. Your marriage even is ironclad. Nothing's going to happen to it. So it puts everybody who is currently married and was married in a state that did not allow abortion. Getting my rights confused here. Did not allow same-sex marriage. You're good. The additional thing it does, and this is the part that I think I'm pretty clear on. Well, let me back up. What it does not do, at least my understanding of the bill, is that if the Supreme Court gets rid of that decision, Alabama can come back and say, all right, no more same-sex marriages in Alabama. We're not doing that. Supreme Court doesn't say we have to. That's done. However, Alabama would have to recognize any other state's same-sex marriage on equal terms. So if you are a couple in Alabama, you can't get married in Alabama. Well, you trying to think of the geography, where closest place you can go. But you fly to another state where they have it, get married, come back to Alabama, and you're good to go. So it's pretty close, but it does not actually force every state to accept same-sex marriages. And I suspect that's because that precise point to dictate what the states do, as opposed to states having to recognize other states' marriages, gives the Supreme Court a potential opening. So in any case, that's what we're talking about. Everything's kind of moving to that. So we're gonna dig into that and a couple other issues. Got what may be the final Jan 6 hearing tomorrow, and some more Joe Manchin nonsense, as always. Before we get to that, let me remind you, Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee, sponsored the Josh Marshall podcast. Thank you, Grady's. It's hot. Yeah, it really is hot right now. It's hard to, I like to avoid thinking about global warming when I can, but like now you really can't. I mean, we all know weather is not climate, but it's like all over the northern hemisphere at the moment. It's hot, like too hot to put on real clothes and shoes to go out for iced coffee. But that doesn't mean you have to suffer without something delicious and cold to sip on. Get a Grady's Cold Brew Beanbag Kit delivered to your door and enjoy smooth, silky iced coffee without ever leaving your house. Each kit makes 36 glasses of iced coffee, which means you'll be ready to weather even the worst heat waves. And with a price tag of just $1 a cup, you'll have money left over to splurge on a kiddie pool. Ready to feel the chill with every sip? Get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Okay, Kate Riga, we're going to talk about this stuff, and we're also going to talk about our list. It's coming, right? I just banged some heads on Slack before we came on the air, and I got them. I bloodied them up, and I got them to agree. We can put it out today. So let's talk first about these bills. What's going on there?
Yeah, so I think I'm really interested in what you talked about in the intro, which is how these fare in the Senate. Because, like you say, just a couple of days ago before the House vote, I mean, Durbin was saying, I don't know if we'll have time to put it on the floor. Our calendar is packed. And I think even though there's a knee jerk kind of anger reaction to that, if something like this is kind of dead on arrival in the Senate, you can understand they're trying to get judges confirmed at like a neck breaking
Yep.
pace right now, which is probably, all things being equal, more important.
And they
But
also have just budgetary stuff that just has to happen.
exactly.
Yeah.
And of course they have to go on recess in August. So
Yes,
all these things being
that's
equal.
that's where it becomes kind of more BS. Like
Exactly.
judges and also vacations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can't skip those.
Yeah,
Ask your
don't go over the
cinema,
top. Don't go over the top. Yeah.
But the question mark for me is, people are now getting into this place where we're seeing some Republican senators being open to it, and that's setting up a flurry of interest, I think, heightened interest in a bill that otherwise people wouldn't be that interested in, except, like you say, to use in campaign ads, maybe. And so, kind of what we know for sure is Rob Portman has decided to co-sponsor it. That was the first big thing. Now, as we remember, Portman is retiring. So he is kind of the prime profile of someone who would be okay with
Yeah.
co-sponsoring
It's
this.
very popular among retirees.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then we had Tom Tillis. It was squishy, but he said basically along the lines of like, I'm considering it, or I'm open to it, or yeah, that sounds like something I could support, but with enough wiggle room that if McConnell ends up being like, draws a line across his neck, you can back out. And then interestingly, as we were discussing right before we went on the air, Romney says it's not something I've given consideration to at this stage because he says, I don't see the law changing. And then you have Lindsey Graham as a flat no. And again, Romney's squish is similar to Tillis's squish, though in the negative realm,
Right.
giving himself
Right.
enough room to change his mind if he wants. But I think it's interesting that his kind of knee-jerk response is to err on the side of no. Because when we're talking about pulling together 10 Republican votes, as we've said before, as soon as you lose a Romney or, even a Graham at times, the bench just gets redder and redder and redder.
Yeah.
It's not like Tommy Tuberville is going to come out of left field and be like, know what? I'm going to vote for this. So it's just, the pool is rather small.
As as I mentioned before we started recording too, though, is that I tend to think of these things as that it's wrong to think of them as individual senators. That really this will happen or not happen because Mitch McConnell and other stakeholders will decide, let's not die on this hill. This is like the decision hasn't even been overruled. So it's not like we're really changing anything. It's kind of already settled. And do we really want to kind of hold this up when it's kind of just let it pass through, or give people a free vote, as opposed, and if they decide that, Mitch McConnell can come up with 10 votes, right? And he'll just call up some new senator and says, guess what, you're voting yes. I mean, he really runs that operation. And so it's a funny thing. I think that can even happen by the caucus itself, as it were, deciding, let's not have this fight. And that even coming from people who are going to vote no, people who are really against it, who are very against same-sex marriage, so these things happen in funny ways. One of the other things we were just talking about is with Romney, and as you say, the sort of the for lack of a better word, non-Trump owned caucus in among Senate Republicans pretty small. If you don't have Romney, kind of like you're not even in the hunt. But an interesting thing was that when I looked at the list, at least the entire Utah House delegation voted yes. And it's interesting because a lot of early anti same-sex marriage political funding and stuff like that came out of Utah and came out of the Mormon Church. And yet, more recently, they've kind of taken a different position. Obviously, in their own theology and so forth, they're totally hardcore on this issue. But they have been a little bit more like, that's just what the state does. If that's gonna help people, kind of live more ordered lives and, be able to visit people in the hospital, whatever. I'm not saying they're like totally indifferent to it, but they've taken a kind of a an increasingly distinct position from white evangelicals. And again, Mormons are not evangelicals. It's a I mean, it's become a big thing over recent decades that Mormons more and more want to say, hey, we're just Christians. Theologically, it is a very distinct religion, blah blah blah, distinct history, all that kind of stuff. So it was a little surprising to me to see Mitt, not only be seem a little negative. He's not only Mormon. I mean, it's I was gonna, it seems strange that I would say, hey, he's also from Utah, but I mean, it's because he's been from a lot of other states in the past, so I have to say that. I guess presumably you get Collins, and anyway, I know that Senate Democrats were making calls and seeing if they could put this together last night, and well, I guess we'll see where it ends up.
And it's interesting to me that the two bills like this that have been introduced is this marriage one and then the enshrining the right to contraception one. And it's hard to tell if this is anything strategic because, like we said, Senate Democrats didn't really think either of these were going to see the light of law anytime soon. So it was really started out as kind of a messaging project from the House. But the contraception one is like further back on the conveyor belt. It was just introduced yesterday. It hasn't, obviously it hasn't passed the House yet or anything like that. And that is interesting to me because I think of these two issues, obviously both in direct response to Clarence Thomas's dissent, where he encouraged, revisiting them. The contraception one is the more kind of natural, I think, next step in terms of where anti-abortion type people want to go. I mean, the anti-contraception thing has always been part of the anti-abortion movement from the beginning, and there have been various attempts to kind of go after different methods of contraception. We've already seen in the immediate aftermath, IUDs coming under suspicion and Plan B coming under suspicion. So it is interesting that we're kind of going with the more extreme one first, right? Like same-sex marriages, while like you say it's of the same privacy universe, it is kind of like distinct in that way.
Right.
It's not as natural a cousin.
and and it's all, I mean, it's distinct in a lot of ways. Another way that it's distinct is that, and again, I don't know a lot of the case law and stuff, but traditionally things like marriage, there's not a federal marriage, right? I mean, that is something that is kind of left to the states to administer and stuff like that. Whereas contraception is, in a basic sense, a medical issue, and so there's a lot of differences that can come up, just in terms of different theories of the power of the federal government. I'm also kind of curious how exactly that is defined in a law. Contraception. I mean, I mean, because it's not. I mean, at some level, kind of like we all know what a contraceptive is, but when you dig into it, it's pretty complex exactly what you're, specific what you're talking about. The other thing is that it's sort of paradoxical because on the one hand, a right to gay marriage to a same-sex marriage in the United States is very new. It's 6 or 7 years old, and yet at a basic level, it's kind of it's in the rearview mirror, I think, for the country. Um, but again, it's it's still pretty recent. With contraception, again, I think for a lot of us, it's hard to even understand that we're even talking about it, right? At a basic level, and yet, as you say, it's probably under more threat than same-sex marriage.
Mm-hmm.
No one's really kind of there's no big move like, oh, we got to kind of turn back the same-sex marriage thing. Kind of, it's,
Right.
just whatever. But as you say, with abortion, they're in the ascendant, and they want to go after contraception too. So it's on the line.
Right. I think that's exactly what I was going to say. And I think part of that, which makes the same sex marriage feel like a more extreme thing to go after, even though it's such a more recent right, is just that struggle is intimately familiar to basically everyone who isn't super, super young, whereas. The Griswold case is old, and that was about contraception for married couples. It is like Roe, I think, in that there is less urgency to preserve these rights when the battle to secure them is so forgotten by so many people, or never lived by so many
Yeah,
people.
yeah. And again, there's I think many people. I want to get myself in trouble here. I think many people who are very pro-choice at least think, okay, to you who are anti-abortion, I get that it's a big deal. I get that it's not
Mm-hmm.
nothing. It's a big step. It's all the kind of stuff. Whereas again, I think for most of us, contraception are sort of like, what's your problem? Like, what can possibly be wrong with that? Like, and
Right.
what possible business is it of yours? It seems bizarre, right?
Well, I think because in a lot of ways, it feels like contraception is something the anti-abortion movement should support, in that if you want to prevent abortions, having easily accessible contraception is pretty much the best way to do it.
Yep. Yep.
And then when you
Yep.
dig into what you're talking about, like the specifics of the contraceptive methods that they call abortifacients, I mean, it is technical and medical and far outstrips most people's kind of basic knowledge of how reproduction works. And a lot of it's wrong. Like the IUD thing in particular, that was just the anti abortion movement taking advantage of the fact that science didn't know for a while how exactly it worked. And then we're getting into the semantics of like implementation of the eggs versus thickening of the mucus and all this kind of crazy stuff that you're like, why, in what possible universe is this making a difference? But that's something that's also an area where the anti-abortion movement has been super successful in just taking complicated medical and scientific realities and just the basic premise of science, which is like you can never be 100% certain about basically anything, and then using that and thus hence that is why it is murdering a baby.
And just for our listeners who may not be versed on this stuff, we all know from, like, the movies we had to watch in high school. Well, again, before we became a theocracy, at least when we used to watch those, where you see that the sperm and the egg meeting, and then then the egg, the fertilized egg, implants and so forth. What we're talking about are these very technical discussions of, did the sperm already, go through the outer
Mm-hmm.
layer of the egg? And okay, fine, but did it move down to here and kind of set up shop to become a baby? Whereas again, I will say that I think a lot of people who are very pro-choice can at least understand that other people might say, hey, once you're pregnant, you've got to, even if it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fetus that is, you'd need a microscope, that it's in process. But here we're talking about, again, did the where's the sperm? What progress is he making? Dad can't do it. It's just like, dude, what? Like,
Right. I mean, and it's also just, I think some of the most like misogynistic elements of the anti-abortion movement become really clear when you're talking about contraception. Like, I had this long interview with this professor who had specialized in the history of the anti-abortion movement and was kind of telling me about how being anti-contraceptives have always been, woven into it. And I asked her, has there been a concerted effort, against condoms? And she said, no. And she said, and my thought is, I mean, that's the one contraceptive method that's in the hands of men, right? Versus women. So it's a whole complicated thing, but it's interesting to me that we're having this battle on the marriage front first. And that I
yeah.
think it seems, I mean, it's been introduced. So we'll see if the contraception one kind of reaches action in the Senate as well.
I do think too that I think a lot of people, I mean, obviously there were many people who couldn't quite believe that Roe was going to be truly overturned,
Uh huh.
because it had gone on for so long, seemingly kind of like hanging in the balance. But I think at a far more profound level, most people just can't imagine that we're actually gonna, there's gonna be a thing where a woman who wants to take, you know, uh, the pill
Mm-hmm.
won't be allowed to, or that like there's going to be a ban on condoms or IUDs or diaphragms or whatever. People just can't quite like that. That's not possible. So I'm
Yeah,
not
and
going to worry about it.
I think that's right. And I think it's predicated on an anti abortion planted notion that abortion is rare, which it's not. I think it's funny. I've talked to some experts who have said, well, they're not going to come after contraceptives. Like, 90% of women of reproductive age use them at some point during the time where they can have children. And it's like, well, 1 in 4 women will have an abortion before the end. So it's not like we're comparing kind of a medical procedure that almost never happens and
Right.
then getting the flu shot. It's just, I think, that is a little bit, I think you're totally right. And I think it's built in this idea that there is less of a culture of shame around contraceptives than there is around abortion. So we're like, yeah, well, everyone uses the pill, and it's like, well, you probably know someone who had an abortion.
Yep.
So, you
Yep.
know,
Well, and
anyway.
that's what we're, that's what we're seeing
Hmm.
unfolding around the country over the last, 3 or 4 weeks, of just how big that shockwave is. And I will say that I mean, very quickly we've seen a lot of horror stories
Yep.
with I mean, we know about the case in Ohio, or yeah, it was Ohio. Then they went to Indiana. The case in Ohio where a 10-year-old girl was raped and got pregnant, and then had to go to Indiana to get an abortion because in Ohio they've got, I guess it's one of these heartbeat bills. But there's been a number of cases that have not still not gotten I mean, they've gotten some publicity, not the equal level of publicity, but women who have had pregnant women who have had medical crises of various sorts, and at least the ones I have heard about, these women haven't died, but lots of blood loss, 7 or 8 days in a very precarious medical state where you could die, um, where you didn't, none of that had to happen because you can just abort the pregnancy, and none of that happens. But there, these kind of crazy cases where it is totally solvable, but they are legally unable to terminate, extract this fetus, because like technically you can there is a pulsating electrical pulse in there that is defined as a heartbeat. Now, is it even a heartbeat? In a lot of ways, no. But I can, and again, none of these women have died, but that's not a great standard,
Hmm.
right? That you're talking about great suffering and very real risk, and it's uh, it's just kind of crazy to think about an extended medical crisis that is totally solvable medically. And the one thing it should make us think about is how even doctors who are trying to do the right thing, when you have these, except for life of the mother, you get into these things. The doctor's like, can I really, is she definitely going to die? Well, no, probably not. And do I want to put myself at the mercy of the local DA who's going to say that I cut her too much slack, that she probably really wasn't going to die? So you have a penumbra of these things where even pretty close calls, the doctors won't touch it because they don't want to get indicted. And like,
Yep. Yeah, I had an interview recently with kind of an abortion historian as well, who was talking about the huge, big success after Roe was that it was legal to study abortion and to do these like clinical trials and to figure out how to do it in a way that is less painful for the women. That is, though she kept using the word respect, that is respectful for the woman and for like the embryo or the fetus. It's just that's how we got all these ways to do it. That's how abortion became so safe and why it became so much less painful. And how we figured out ways that in situations where the woman really wants the baby, you can, abort it often in a way that she can hold it before all this kind of stuff, all this way of making this part of healthcare less horrible for the people involved. And now we're asking the people who have the tools to make this a safe and comfortable procedure, like you say, to, flirt with sepsis or have women go into these like medical states of peril that are completely avoidable. And I think you wrote about this, but we're seeing this move of the anti-abortion faction to kind of downplay this stuff. I mean, in the case of the 10-year-old girl who was raped, to pretend that it's completely invented. And
right.
it's so, and I understand how that suits their political goals. So of course they're going to do that, but it's just none of this is a surprise. And I've seen so many people kind of be like, well, we didn't expect to see all these horror stories at once. It's like, why didn't you expect that? I mean, we know how high the sexual assault rates are for women and for girls in this country. Of course, this is going to happen. This is going to happen on a weekly basis. And it's either that anti abortion people are less, just care less about that than they do about, quote unquote, saving the unborn, or the cruelty is the point. I mean, that this is seen as a fit punishment for any woman who's not in a situation where she is married, where she is the mother of a household, and she is having children the way that apparently an enormous sect of the country thinks she should be having children. So,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
it's it it's and I think the only break on these horror stories is people's willingness to come forward, right?
Mhm.
There's with this terrible story of the 10-year-old girl in Ohio. We don't know, like, if maybe the decision was made for her or for her parents. We don't know the exact decision, but if you had a choice, why would you come forward? Like, why would you add to the trauma, both of the rape and having to travel to get the abortion, and now suddenly everybody's like, the whole nation is kind of looking at you. No one wants that. Or these cases where, you know um, a pregnant woman has one of these sort of, partial miscarriages, where if you can't go in and terminate the pregnancy, you have this kind of long, this medical crisis. No one wants to have that, scrutiny of
Mhm.
themselves. And it's always like, there's not, most of the news media doesn't publicize the names, but they're talking about you, and people in your circle know it's you. And it's surprising how many people are willing to come forward. Or sometimes people, the decision is made for them. But as you say, I mean, it's a big country. There's lots of high risk pregnancies. There's lots, unfortunately, there are lots of rapes, and some of them result in pregnancies. So it shouldn't surprise us that, like, yes, these things happen all the time. And you know, it is certainly a lot of people. You know, we can get into, oh, why didn't you know? Why didn't you expect? Why are you surprised? But look, there's a big chunk of the population that is just not top of mind. But now it's you know, it's kind of it's on the front pages every day.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about a separate thing that's going on in Congress, which is that Joe Manchin yet again, e.g., blew up negotiations being fully conducted within his own party. You know, this time it was just Manchin and Chuck Schumer, and it was done very much behind closed doors. And it had reportedly gotten to the point that staffers were writing up legislative text for this version of the reconciliation bill, which you'll remember as at one point being the sprawling kind of country changing bill that would have had huge climate plans. It would have strengthened the social safety net. It would have had healthcare cost mitigation. That now, in this version that Schumer was negotiating with Manchin, would have been narrowed down to lowering prescription drug costs for seniors, extending ACA subsidies, which we'll talk about more because that's a really critical thing that's not getting a ton of play. It would have had some tax credits for climate stuff. Um, and it would have raised taxes on some wealthy people and some quote unquote pass through corporations to kind of pay for the rest of it. So this was exactly the deal that Manchin said he wanted when he blew up Build Back Better on live television after stringing along Democrats for months and months and months. This is the deal he said he'd be down with. So basically, you know, this was Schumer kind of trying to act out this Democratic cry of just let Manchin write the bill. You know, he was basically letting Manchin write the bill. And then at the 11th hour, again, Manchin says, you know what? Fuck this. Never mind. I'm not doing it. And you know why I'm not doing it? Because inflation is high. And it's like inflation has been high throughout. This is not a new revelation. Also, if you know, I did all this reporting at the time about whether Build Back Better would have an inflationary impact, and like this wide swath of experts said no because it's not a stimulus bill and it's meant to kind of come online slowly and all these other reasons. This is a much smaller, less stimulus-y Build Back Better. I mean, there's just no way it would have an inflationary impact to speak
Yeah,
of.
there were that was even someone like Larry Summers, who was like the big inflation hawk,
Mm-hmm.
who you know, in some ways has been, you know, whether he was smart or lucky, who knows, but in some ways he's been vindicated by his skepticism about the big aid bill in January, you know, January,
Mm-hmm.
February 2021. Even he was like, yeah, Build Back Better is not going to be a problem inflation wise, because as you say, it is not a big infusion of cash into the economy. It's over a long period of time, and at least the original Build Back Better was on things, you know, various you know, investment in infrastructure, investment in this. It's just it's not. And you know, God, the one thing to just emphasize for listeners is that, like, this isn't a matter of kind of like, you know, the majority leaders trying to keep all the different players on the same page and you're almost there. It's only Manchin. The entire caucus basically said to Chuck Schumer, you know, sort of signed over to Chuck Schumer power of attorney.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you can get an agreement on with Joe Manchin, we will vote for it. And so, as you say, they had an agreement, and then just he said no, and it's just it's absurd at a certain point, and clearly we're way past that point. And then yesterday, though, they're talking about they may and for clarity, at least what Manchin says, it's the climate stuff that is too, which again, climate stuff is not going to be inflationary. That's just not. That's not how it works. Um, the climate stuff that he was against, and oh, I'll still do these other little things. But understandably, the Democrats like, no, dude, like you won't, like I'm not even going to talk to you. You know how you clearly you were a liar. And now they're saying they might give it one more. Or we were talking about this before we started recording, that it's a little, it's kind of ambiguous. Are they saying they might go for yet another
Mm-hmm.
round with him, or is it just that kind of like they don't want to bum him out because they still want to try to get the ACA subsidies? And I'll tell you, the thing is, it's I mean, it drives me crazy that like another round with this like serial liar, because you know when you negotiate, what he's doing is lying. Negotiation is a process where you sort of click off agreements one step at a time, and you know kind of like you agree to this here and that, and based on that agreement you agree to this, and down down down. If you get to the end and just say no, you're breaking trust there. It's not just a matter of you didn't like the bill, you're lying. And it drives people crazy, like, are you going to do it again? And yet if there's a 1% chance that he's going to agree to something over the next 3 months, he's the only way you're going to get it. So do you just say, fuck it, we're done? It's a tough position to be in.
Yeah. I mean, let's lay out the disparate pieces that we know right now. Okay, we know that the ACA subsidies are not an option for Democrats because basically this comes from the 2021 American Rescue Plan, where they increased these tax subsidies, which made it cheaper for low income people to get coverage and expanded these credits to middle class people for the first time. And that provoked a record number of people signing up for plans. We about 14 million. Okay. And now the subsidies are going to expire at the end of this year. And that's going to leave 13 million people with losing their coverage altogether or seeing their premiums skyrocket. About 3 million of those people expect to just lose coverage. And kind of to add political insult to real life injury, most people will find out about their perhaps financially disastrous change in healthcare status in October, which is like right when people are going to start voting in the midterms. And Republicans are already adopting a position of like, you know, not our circus, not our monkeys. This is your Obamacare type thing. So they're not going to help. So it has to be done through reconciliation, which is kind of why I think there was an infusion of life into these renegotiations with Manchin, just because they have to do it. They have to do it. So basically, after Manchin torpedoed everything, Biden was like, look, I'm going to do everything I can with climate through executive action. In the meantime, pass the ACA and pass, if you can get any kind of prescription drug cost lowering in there, past that too. And just, which is, I mean, we should just take a minute to think about that is what Build Back Better has become. You know, it just, it is staggering, but there's no choice, right? You have to pass it. So that's what Biden said to do. And then we have what you alluded to, Josh, and this kind of weird delay is that, so we have Biden came out with a statement right away where he said, I'm going to do executive action on climate. I'm going to do everything I can. And then you had someone like Sheldon Whitehouse tweet out this whole list of executive action-y stuff that the Biden administration can do. And so we expected one of the first things there to be for Biden to declare a climate emergency to just kind of give him more leeway to act. And that's not happening this week. You know, the press secretary told reporters it's on the table, don't expect it this week, which then you have, okay, what's going on here? You know, why the delay? And I guess there was some Axios reporting saying that the delay is because they think that Manchin might be winnable. And obviously, we would prefer to have climate stuff in law versus in executive action. Plus, there's more than one reconciliation package at this point. So there is a world you can imagine where you get the ACA stuff, maybe some drug stuff, stamp, sign, deliver, get that out the door, because they also need to do that quickly because the healthcare stuff will start revving up in August. So you got to get that done. And then, like you say, what if there's like this slim chance that Manchin will be amenable to climate stuff? Well, you don't want to piss him off and then kind of write that out of the deal. And like you mentioned right before we went on air, Josh, it's like in the grand scheme of the climate disaster, you know, is a month or two going to make or break us, especially because we're probably already broken? You know, probably not. But then it's just so infuriating because it's exactly what Manchin wants. It's exactly what
Yeah.
he does every time. He blows up the deal and he says, hey, now I'm where I've always been. I'm willing to negotiate. I just don't like the high inflation. You know, I still want to do climate. I want to do energy. And he's done this every single time. And to
Yeah.
me, I'm just like, his one, kind of concrete thing he said was, I want to see the July inflation numbers before I'm like ready to deal again. And I find that completely unbelievable, not just because he's the least trustworthy actor we've ever interacted with, but also inflation is not something that dissipates month by month. So, say the inflation numbers for July come out and we've ticked down some tenths of a percent. Does anyone really think at this still, quite high inflation level, Manchin's going to be like, you know what? I'm nothing if not a man of my word. Inflation has gone down. Let's do climate. I mean, he's not going to.
Right. Right. Right.
I
It's
mean, what do you think? I think Biden should just go for it.
this is one of those things where, as cliche as it is, there's no good option.
Yep.
I hear from people every day who are saying, like, where's the leadership? They have the majority. Make him do it. They can't. They can't. I know a lot of people think that. You're fooling yourself. You either don't know what's happening or you're lying to yourself. No one in the Democratic caucus, no one at the White House has the power to force his hand. They don't. And that is just a cold reality that is terribly upsetting and demoralizing, but that doesn't make it less of a fact. And it's not a fact because Joe Biden didn't push hard enough or yell enough or something like that. Joe Biden may be fucking up about a million things. He does not have the power to do this. And so there's one of the big things in the way I think about politics is that it is always important to be respectful of your own and your political coalition's dignity. You don't make a fool of yourself. You don't act like a fool. You don't allow people to make you an object of ridicule, because that's just bad mojo. It demoralizes groups. It demoralizes people. It 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 cheats them of their power. And yet, you know, if we have the chance of doing something significant on climate in the next 2 or 3 months, and I think anybody would be a fool to believe that's going to happen, but it could happen. And do you really want to just have the satisfaction of saying, Joe Manchin, fuck you, Joe Manchin. We're not going to be an idiot for you anymore. When there's still a chance of that, I think you kind of have to try. Now the question is, do you wreck other things on that very thin hope? I don't know. I don't have good answers. It's a I would certainly understand if they try to thread the needle a bit more over the next 2 or 3 months, because look, it's very possible there will be no Senate majority in in 6 months, in which case it will absolutely not happen until 2025 at the earliest.
Yeah. I mean, here's my slight pushback to that, even though I do agree on the whole, which is just you'd rather have a law than an executive order, right? It's much more stable and it's harder to undo. But if executive orders right now have the shelf life of 2024, don't you want to get that stuff online as quickly as
Well,
possible?
so here's a kind of factual question that I need to understand more. It is my strong assumption that it's not just a question of durability, that Biden can't do nearly as much through executive actions as the Senate can do
Totally.
through legislation,
Mhm.
A. And B, you've got the Supreme Court.
Yep.
How many of those executive actions are going to be dead on arrival within a few weeks?
Totally. I mean,
So,
and
you
the
know,
other thing is just, I think this kind of built in assumption that, like, oh, we don't want to piss Manchin off by doing anything through. that it's not even clear to me that that's what would happen. I mean, Manchin doesn't really act in a rational way like 90% of the time, you know?
No, I agree with that, and I think the best counter to all of this is you're not going to get his attention if you're constantly kowtowing to him.
Mm-hmm.
That you need to say, okay, fine, done, we're moving on,
Right.
and we'd love to do the deal, but like we're not going to worry about things that might piss you off.
Yeah, like you let us know when you're ready to deal.
Yeah,
I mean, and the
yeah.
other piece of this that I wanted to say when you were talking about how you hear from people all the time talking about how Democratic leadership has bungled this, and it's kind of their fault for not handling Manchin. Two things. The first is we now have data points of Democrats trying to do it in the way that they got criticized for not doing it during Build Back Better, right? Which is that people said he loves to be the center of attention and you're doing this all in public. And that means that every time he blows up any piece of the bill, it's a huge raft of headlines and it's a huge spotlight right on him, right? So this time, Schumer does it like completely in private. Very little was known about this deal before Manchin blew it up. And there was no pressuring Manchin in public. There was no naming him in press releases. I mean, it's like they acted
Both of
completely on
which
the
are of course also absurd
totally
as anything that any normal person would get upset about.
right. But they took like all the criticism from the last time and acted on it, and it resulted in exactly the same
And it wasn't
conclusion.
even the first time, for our listeners. Last year, I mean, I lose track of what's in what year, but I think it was last year or early this year, with voting rights and the
Mm-hmm.
filibuster. They made this judgment of, okay, if we go to Joe Manchin and say, hey, you write a bill, you write it, we're
Mm-hmm.
not even going to negotiate it with you, you write it and talk to your Republican buddies, and and we'll vote for anything you can get them to agree to, and we'll just call it a voting rights bill because we're totally under your power. And they did that. And the thinking was, all right, if he writes his own bill and his own ego was on the line and no Republicans will sign on, he's just going to say, all right, fuck it. Fuck the filibuster. You screwed me. We're doing this with 50 votes. And in fact, he did the bill, his bill. He supported it. They didn't agree. And he's like, well, guess we're done.
Plus, he got to run out like 2 months of clock while doing that, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then just the other thing, which is just more for a chuckle, is this came up in like a social setting I was in last week, and someone was like, you know what? If Trump was president, he would have been able to make Manchin do what he wanted. And I was just like, Trump had a trifecta and they passed the tax cuts and like that's it. I mean, it's so funny. I think we have this vision of Trump that still stems from the 2016 upset that he's like somehow masterful at politics in a way that other people aren't. And it just, I was like, what evidence do we have that Trump was legislatively savvy at all? He could do almost nothing and he blew
Yeah.
up his own party stuff routinely.
Yeah. He was an extremely ineffective president as a
Yeah.
legislator. I mean, much worse than usual, and it's hardly surprising because he was totally ignorant of the process, and he had. I mean, look, you do need to kind of knock some heads sometimes, but he has none of the qualities. He doesn't have the smarts or the knowledge to really dig into it, and he's famously conflict averse.
Mm. Or
He's
the
a
attention
coward.
span.
Yeah, attention span. I mean, one one obvious thing is Obamacare. Couldn't get it
Mm.
done.
Yeah,
Couldn't get it done.
right.
You know.
Okay, so let's do kind of a quick preview of the January 6th hearing tomorrow, which has been marketed as kind of like the big finale, you know, the big primetime finale. But now we're already hearing the committee say, well, we've unearthed more stuff since the hearings have started. So there might be more tacked on. But this is going to be the big one that's about the 187 minutes during the insurrection. What was Trump doing and where are our gaps in that knowledge? And our colleague Matt actually has up on the site now a really good piece that pulls together from lawmakers, reporters, researchers, like everything we know in that TikTok of what was happening, what he was doing, and what we don't know. And I think kind of the latest breaking piece of this is this whole Secret Service kerfuffle where we've suddenly found out that after the texts from Secret Service agents have been subpoenaed, all of a sudden those texts have disappeared, and I think it was like initially passed off as some routine switching over of devices, but now we're getting conflicting accounts about, are these texts gettable, are they not? The Secret Service got all pissy about saying, well, this malicious implication, but that's kind of a late breaking piece of this.
Yeah, I've had a really hard time getting my head around this, because this is what they are saying. Kate is right that the story has gotten a little more muddled, but
Mm-hmm.
basically their story is something like this. We were upgrading our hardware, our phones, our pagers, whatever you're using to text. Sort of showing my age here about pagers. With upgrading our hardware, and some stuff didn't get backed up, and now the hardware's gone, and so it's gone. And how we were backing stuff up was, we sent out a note to every agent to uh, be sure to upload the texts on your phone to this server, and that's their document retention plan. Now, that does not pass the laugh test. That is not. I mean, many of you work in big organizations, or you work for the government or something like this. Document retention is a big thing, and document security, and so on and so forth. And there are very serious federal laws that deal with presidential records and stuff. And the idea that I mean, look, I love the Secret Service agents in the movies, right? They're great guys and everything. But look, let's be honest. They're not like tech dudes, right? You're sending an email to, like, Fred, who's 55 and works at Secret Service, and he's supposed to kind of figure out how to upload his text messages somewhere, and there's no redundancy if he forgets. Basically, what they're saying is a lot of the guys just didn't do it, and so it's gone. That is not. There was parts of the federal government in the late 90s that worked that way, and maybe even in the early aughts. There's so many regulations that are covered. That is really, really hard to believe that is remotely what happened. And the sort of the best, it's not even a defense, but sort of explanation is that, and let's for a moment take this explanation on its own terms. The Secret Service institutionally does not like talking about anything to do with things that come up in the process of their protective duties.
Mm-hmm.
And for really good reason. You need the president to just trust you with anything, because he can't be ducking away and going out of your line of sight or something like that. So, okay, that makes sense, but you still don't get to destroy federal records. Like, no matter what your reason is, you can't do that. That's a big time felony. The other thing is, though, and I was talking to someone kind of in that, not someone at the Secret Service, but kind of in that policing, national security world kind of thing yesterday. And I would say the second most innocent, although it's not innocent at all, explanation is that there was a lot of chatter of Secret Service guys saying, yeah, fuck Nancy Pelosi. She has it coming. And fuck Mike Pence. He betrayed Trump. And look, what is it about what you know about middle-aged white law enforcement dudes that makes you think they wouldn't be really into Trump? Of course they would. Of course they were into Trump. And what we know of those two people who the whole thing about the blow up in the car, those guys were picked by Trump to take on leadership positions out of the Secret Service. So out of a pretty Trumpy population, he picked the most Trumpy people. So you think they weren't saying some stuff that, even if they didn't do bad things, would look really bad seeing the light of day. That's not at all hard to imagine. And yet, is it really possible that they thought it would be that they'd get away with just destroying all the text messages? I can't. And I suspect that is where a lot of the other government infrastructure is right now, of kind of saying like, walk me through this, because I think it's hard for anybody to believe. Did you actually destroy all the documents, and you think that's going to be okay? Because none of the options here make any sense, and yet here we are,
Right. And then we're on this like weird kind of technological precipice of like, once a text has been sent, is there any way to really kind of strike it off the face of the earth? I don't know. Maybe not.
It's I even had someone telling me kind of like, doesn't the NSA sweep up everything? Can't they can't they whip it up? I mean,
It's a good question.
I have no idea,
We
but
lay people don't know.
yeah, well, it's weird because like for civilians, our texts are on servers, whether it's our texts are all over the place. If someone really wants to find them, the texts, I mean, the stuff the Secret Service does is of such profound national security secrecy. You're talking about what the president does moment to moment. You can't have that showing up on like Google servers, or transiting through some kind of technology wires that are abroad. You need that to be really tight within the federal government, or at least as they the federal government does a huge amount of business with the Amazon cloud. But it's not like the cloud you and I use. They're not just like uploading the NSA stuff onto, up onto an AWS cloud. Basically, how that works is the Amazon is sort of handing over control of a part of their cloud thing under all sorts of protections that the federal government has control over, blah, 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 blah. So I don't know. The whole thing is so crazy. I really can't get my head around it. And again, I think the reason it hasn't quite caught fire yet is that a lot of senior journalists, a lot of senior government technology people, a lot of senior law enforcement people are kind of thinking like, you can't really have destroyed the records and thought that was going to work. So let's go through this again, because it can't be as unbelievable as it seems to be.
Right. So yeah, come follow along with us tomorrow. We're going to be live blogging and all that. It'll be a primetime one, so should be big.
Must see TV.
Exactly. So let's take this question real quick before we wrap. Carl says it appears Senate Democrats will try to get a reconciliation bill through which only addresses Medicare prescriptions and ACA subsidies. Does this have the full support of Democrats in the House, or will some liberals or Josh Gottheimer blow it up? So we don't exactly know yet, because having moved on to this thing is fairly new. But I would say Gottheimer kind of attempted to make a stink again with this narrowed down bill that Schumer and Manchin were working on, and said, hey, if there's no SALT tax, I'm not going to be there. If there's no provision addressing the SALT tax. And this came up before. We all remember, like, he does this routinely every time he feels like he's not getting enough attention and Manchin's getting it all. But even that, like, kind of quote unquote rebellion, the one piece that was written about it that I wrote, it was him and one other guy from New Jersey. So I don't think, I mean, we haven't seen the liberals blow up anything. There's this constant refrain of like, well, the progressives ruin everything. It's like, actually, they've been on board with anything that can get passed. But
yeah.
I do think the ACA subsidies are so dire that even someone who freaking loves the spotlight, like Josh Gottheimer, I don't even know if he would be able to wrangle up enough Democrats to murder something so important, especially when there is at least a suggestion of another reconciliation bill coming down the pike.
Yeah, and it is funny because as Kate says, when it seemed like this Manchin Schumer thing was going to work, Gottheimer came forward like, okay, let's talk.
Here I
Now I'm in.
am.
Yeah, here I am. Let this isn't over. And Manchin sort of did him the favor of blowing it up, but before it even
Mm,
got there. Um, I kind of think you're right. I think Gottheimer would do anything, but he's only one vote, and as close
exactly.
as it is in the House, they have more than a one vote margin. I really doubt that kind of more than anyone else would jump in there. And look, the House repeatedly over the last 20 years, it happened with the ACA because of the dynamics of the Senate and 60 votes and all, reconciliation, all those kind of things. The House Democratic Caucus often ends up having to just pass Senate versions of the bill because
Hmm.
there's no other choice.
Right.
And I'm pretty confident that would happen in this case. There's one more thing before we sign off that okay, we didn't mention is our list.
Ah,
Our
yes.
list is coming. We have our Rowan reform scorecard. I mean, I don't like calling it scorecard exactly because that makes it sound like kind of frivolous, and obviously this is anything but frivolous. But it is a scorecard in this way that Kate and I, mainly Kate, have been putting together this list, and it may come out today, Wednesday, July 20th. If not, it'll come out tomorrow. And basically, what it is where every Senate Democrat stands on passing a Roe law and suspending the filibuster rules to ensure it gets a up or down 50-50 vote, majority vote. And the key here is it is always the advantage of legislators that they want to keep everything obscure. You know, the Senate Democratic Caucus isn't there yet. The caucus doesn't support it yet. Well, if you are a citizen, a constituent, a voter who wants to say, why not? Who do I talk to? Who do I call up? Who's the problem? Well, it's just the caucus isn't there. That doesn't help you. You want to know specifically because there is no caucus. There's 50 senators. And so it's that. So what we're trying to do here is break it down and tell you. In a way, it's sort of a DIY legislative whipping guide, to whip a piece of legislation, get all the votes in line. What can you as a citizen do? So how these work is it seems like we're breaking it down into 5 categories. You got the yeses, and there's about 30 yeses. People say, yep, I'm there for it. We're all set. We know there's 2 no's, Manchin and Cinema. And then we've basically got it down to 3 more groups. There's one group who they say they're for a Roe law. They also say they're for filibuster reform, but they have not been willing to join the 2 in a statement. And this is not just our being, dicks about it, right? It's important because unless you're really connecting them, it's still like, are we going to get there? Are you really willing to do it? Well, probably they are, but they haven't said it.
It's also, I would just like to interject, the most Senate brain afflicted group because there is no policy position where you want filibuster reform and you want abortion protections, but you don't want them together. That just doesn't exist. But it's this dynamic Josh is talking about where it's like, you don't want to stick your neck out, you don't want to be ahead of the pack at all. So you
And and
hang back.
and it's also part of Senate world and Senate brain to say like, hey, I take these issues very seriously. I don't want to make it slogans. I don't want to. I don't want to. This is a thoughtful process.
Hmm.
Don't rush me. Don't try to tie me down. And it's sort of this is where you get into like, this isn't a private club of 100 people you're part of. You work for us.
Right.
What do you mean? Don't do this. Don't do that. Thoughtful. Whatever. We want a straight answer. Okay, so that's another dozen people or so,
Hmm.
right? Okay. Then you have about 6 that just they have not commented. They haven't said anything, or they've said something so amorphous and meaningless as it amounts to the same thing. Now, one key point about how we go about this is, you know, some journalists might just say, "Oh, just haven't, there's nothing there. We know nothing about them." Not exactly. Democrats have been talking about this for about a month. I mean, in some ways, been talking about it for years, but specifically this thing: are you going to do this? And the president of the United States a couple weeks ago said, "Just give us 2 senators. That's all we need." So the president of the United States has basically committed the 48 senators to do this. If they haven't commented yet, it's not that they didn't hear about this. It's not that they don't think anybody's interested. It's a decision not to comment about it. They've decided they do not want to comment, and that is a position in itself. And as constituents, as voters, as citizens, you should know that. Okay, your position is you don't think we even deserve an answer. So that's about half a dozen, and then. And at present, it seems like there's 2. Do you want to talk about these 2?
Yeah, so basically we separated Angus King and Mark Warner into this last kind of middling position because they're both people who, while we know 48 Democrats supported filibuster reform when it came down to the voting law, but basically all they're on the record talking about with filibuster reform is that they don't like it. In the case of King, who basically all he said on the linkage of abortion protections and filibuster reform is, well, we got to be careful because then Republicans will just pass an abortion ban. Like, that's basically everything he said about it has been negative and kind of expressing dubiousness about this plan. And then for Warner, when he came around on the reform to pass the voting rights bill, he said, very specifically, this is the only reform I'll consider, this carve out for the voting rights thing. So they're in their own category because they have not expressed support of filibuster reform philosophically at all. They're different from the Say Nothing group because they're not saying nothing. What they're saying is expressing that they don't like the idea or that they don't like the concept of filibuster reform as applied to anything more than voting rights. And I do want to be abundantly clear that neither Josh nor I are saying that in this hypothetical situation, say like Fetterman wins and a couple other Democrats win, and somehow Democrats hold the House and this comes up. We're not saying that Angus King or Mark Warner is going to transform into Joe Manchin and be like, no, I'm not voting for this. I'm destroying it. What we're saying is there is a morale raising and election winning tactic that centers on we need 2 more senators and we need the House, and then we will pass abortion protections. And you can't say that unless you've got 48 senators saying, yep, this I am all in
Like
now and
signed
I
on
will
the
be
dotted
all in
line.
there.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so Warner and King are decidedly not saying that. And that doesn't mean that they won't come around. That doesn't mean that they didn't come around on voting rights. If push comes to shove, they are dependable Democratic votes. They probably will. But in terms of rallying behind or coalescing behind this message now, they are the next biggest outliers after
And they're
Manchin
holding
and
it up.
Cinema.
They're
Right.
holding it up for people who want to say like, yeah, whatever. They promised last time.
Mm-hmm.
They point to these people. Well, how do you know these 2? Then it's you need 4 seats. 2 seats is a real challenge. 4 seats that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Plus, it's the politicos of the world's absolute favorite story to say, it's not just Manchin and Cinema, which Politico and all their ran that article before the voting rights reform vote, which 48 people voted for. So it wasn't even correct. But it does just kind of, like you say, it gives space for doubt, and it takes away kind of the solid action oriented statement of we only need 2 senators and we know we only need 2 senators.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And as Kate says, in an electoral context, you need to say, it's baked. we've got 48 signed up, committed, publicly committed. Give us 2, and we're going to deliver because we can deliver, right? And just I'll just emphasize and agree with Kate's point. I'm highly confident that those 48 senators are all going to sign on for this eventually. But it's going to take, in a few of these cases, it's going to take their constituents to force their hand. And there may be some others that need some hand forcing. Chris Coons, Joe Bipartisan, Joe, don't rush me. This is a special club we have, So it's as Kate was suggesting, it's sort of a fine balance here. You got to push, you got to force, you got to demand, but we also don't want people like, it turns out there's not even 48. It's all for naught. What's the point? There will be, but you got to make it happen. So anyway, we're gonna that's probably gonna come out today. If not, it'll come out tomorrow. And then you look at it and see who's where. And if you need to make some calls and make your voice heard, because as Kate says, having that crystal clear is a very big deal, both for holding on to the Democratic Congress and having the opportunity to say back to the Supreme Court, you know what? No. You did it. We're undoing it. And that could happen as soon as January 2023. That's not that far away. And that's the kind of thing that, what is important in politics is, all of the anger and all of the fear and all of the outrage that so many people are feeling right now. They're kind of like, how did this happen? And all that fury. Politically, you want to sort of bundle that up and channel it towards you can do something. You're not powerless. You can undo this, and here's the path. And we're trying to at least make clear where that path is. So I guess that's about it, right, Kate? We've covered everything under the sun. Mm-hmm. All right. The Josh Marshall podcast brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. As you know, you can get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com. Promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Remember, we're going to have coverage of the big maybe finale, asterisk. There may actually be more hearings, but the semi-finale tomorrow. And I guess that's about it.
All right. See you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.